I didn't realize my humiliation had been planned until I saw my face on the giant screen above the ballroom and read the words beneath it. The woman who almost ruined our future. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. At 69 years old, I blamed my eyes before I blamed my family. The Crystal Harbor Ballroom was filled with nearly 300 guests that evening. Business partners, longtime employees, community leaders, friends, and relatives had gathered to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Hayes Industrial Solutions, the company my late husband and I had built from nothing more than a rented garage and a second-hand pickup truck. Golden lights reflected from crystal chandeliers. Soft piano music drifted through the room. Waiters moved between tables carrying plates that cost more than what Harold and I once spent on groceries for an entire week. Everything looked elegant. Everything looked perfect. Then my photograph appeared on the screen. It was an old picture taken nearly 20 years ago. I was smiling in it. Beneath the image, those words remained for several long seconds while confused laughter spread across the room. Some people glanced at me. Others looked away. A few exchanged uncomfortable smiles. I felt every eye in the ballroom finding me at once. Across the room, my daughter-in-law Vanessa stood beside my son Ethan. Her expression was calm, almost pleased. Ethan looked startled, but he didn't step forward. He didn't say a word. The master of ceremonies awkwardly moved on to the next slide, but the damage had already been done. The room returned to its conversations. The music continued. Glasses clinked. Yet something had shifted. I remained seated at table 7 with my hands folded in my lap. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. The woman seated beside me leaned closer and whispered that it was probably some kind of mistake. I smiled politely and thanked her. Inside, however, I knew better. Mistakes do not survive multiple approvals. Mistakes do not appear on screens in front of hundreds of people. Someone had wanted that message displayed. Someone had wanted me embarrassed. I lifted my water glass and took a small sip. Years earlier, I might have stood up and demanded an explanation. I might have confronted Vanessa immediately. But age teaches lessons that youth rarely understands. Sometimes silence reveals more than anger ever can. From across the ballroom, I watched Vanessa speaking with several executives. She laughed easily. She looked confident, like someone who believed she had already won. The rest of the evening passed slowly. During speeches, my name was barely mentioned. During presentations, my contributions seemed to disappear entirely. Listening from my seat, a stranger would have assumed the company began only after Vanessa married into the family. Harold was praised. Ethan was praised. Vanessa was praised. I became invisible. Yet the more invisible I felt, the more closely I paid attention. Little details began to stand out. Certain people avoided eye contact with me. Others appeared nervous whenever Vanessa approached. Questions started forming in my mind. Questions I could not yet answer. When the final applause echoed through the ballroom, I looked once more toward the stage. Vanessa raised a champagne glass and smiled as cameras flashed around her. She thought the story was finished. She thought I would quietly accept the role she had written for me. What she didn't know was that humiliation has a strange way of uncovering hidden truths. And before long, facts would begin surfacing that no one in that room was prepared to hear. The ballroom emptied shortly after 10 o'clock, but I remained seated for several minutes after most of the guests had left. Workers were already clearing tables and folding decorations. The celebration that had taken months to organize was disappearing piece by piece, just like my place in the company seemed to be disappearing. I watched employees carry away flower arrangements while the last notes of piano music faded into silence. No one approached me. No one apologized. No one explained what had happened. Eventually, I picked up my purse and walked toward the parking lot alone. The autumn air felt cooler than I expected. My car sat beneath a row of decorative lights that still sparkled above the pavement. As I drove home, the city lights blurred through the windshield. My hands remained steady on the steering wheel, but my thoughts refused to settle. I kept replaying the evening in my mind. The photograph, the message, the uncomfortable laughter, Vanessa's expression, Ethan's silence. That silence bothered me more than anything else. When Ethan was a little boy, he used to defend me over the smallest things. If a neighbor criticized my garden, Ethan would immediately insist that it was the prettiest yard on the street. If someone forgot my birthday, he would become offended on my behalf. Somewhere along the way, that protective little boy had disappeared. By the time I arrived home, the clock on my dashboard read 10:47 p.m. The house greeted me with the familiar stillness I had known since Harold passed away 3 years earlier. I turned on the kitchen light and set my purse on the counter. The room looked exactly as I had left it that morning. A ceramic bowl of apples sat in the center of the table. Harold's old coffee mug remained on a shelf near the window. Some habits are difficult to abandon, even after loss. I poured myself a glass of water and sat quietly at the table. For a while, I simply listened to the refrigerator humming in the background. Then something unexpected happened. The more I thought about the evening, the less emotional I became. The embarrassment slowly gave way to curiosity. Certain details no longer felt random. During the presentation, several slides had highlighted company milestones. I remembered noticing that my name appeared only once. Years earlier, every anniversary presentation had included photographs of Harold and me working in the original garage. This year, those images were gone. Another memory surfaced. 6 months earlier, I had visited the company website and noticed that the founders section looked different. At the time, I assumed it was part of a redesign. Now I was not so sure. Then I remembered a conversation from the previous spring. One of the senior managers had started to tell me something during a charity luncheon before Vanessa interrupted and quickly changed the subject. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Sitting alone in my kitchen, however, the pieces began fitting together in a way that made me uneasy. The evening at the ballroom had not been an isolated incident. It felt more like the latest step in a process that had been unfolding for a long time. I looked toward the framed photograph of Harold hanging on the far wall. His smile seemed as calm as ever. For the first time that night, I reached for a notebook and began writing down every unusual thing I could remember. If there was a reason behind what happened, I intended to find it. And somewhere deep inside, I had the growing feeling that someone was hoping I would never start asking questions. The next morning I woke before sunrise, something I had done almost every day since Harold and I started the company 25 years earlier. Old habits remain long after circumstances change. I made coffee, opened the curtains above the kitchen sink, and watched the first light settle across the backyard. Everything looked peaceful. The maple tree Harold planted was turning shades of gold and red. A pair of birds hopped across the fence line. From the outside, my life appeared calm and comfortable. Yet my notebook sat on the kitchen table beside me, filled with questions that refused to leave my mind. After breakfast, I decided to stop relying on memories alone. If something had changed inside the company, I needed facts. I opened my laptop and visited the corporate website. At first glance, everything looked polished and professional. Vanessa had always been skilled at presentation. The homepage featured new branding, updated photographs, and glowing descriptions of recent achievements. Then I clicked on the company history section. My stomach tightened. Years ago, the page had included photographs of Harold and me standing inside the original garage where the business began. There had been pictures of our first delivery truck, our first warehouse, and our earliest employees. Now almost all of those images were gone. In their place were newer photographs featuring Ethan and Vanessa. The written history had changed as well. Harold's name appeared several times. Ethan's name appeared even more. Mine appeared only once in a brief sentence that described me as an early supporter of the company. An early supporter. I stared at the screen in disbelief. I had not supported the company. I had built it. I remembered balancing invoices on the kitchen table while raising a young son. I remembered driving supplies across 3 states when we could not afford a shipping service. I remembered nights when Harold and I slept only 4 hours because payroll was due and orders needed to be filled. Yet according to the revised history, I had become little more than a footnote. The more I looked, the more strange details I found. Several articles from previous years were missing entirely. A founder's interview had disappeared. Even a community award Harold and I accepted together was no longer mentioned. Around noon, I called a former employee named Linda Foster. She had worked with us for nearly 18 years before retiring. If anyone would notice changes, it would be Linda. We spoke for almost an hour. At first, she sounded hesitant. Then, after a long pause, she asked a question that immediately captured my attention. "Margaret, has anyone talked to you about what has been happening lately?" I felt my grip tighten around the phone. I told her no. Another silence followed. Linda carefully explained that over the past year, several longtime employees had expressed concern about decisions being made behind closed doors. Some departments were being reorganized without explanation. Historical company records were being updated. Certain names were receiving less recognition. Others were receiving more. Nothing she described was illegal or dramatic. Yet together the changes painted an unsettling picture. Before ending the call, Linda said something that stayed with me all afternoon. She said, "It feels like someone is rewriting the story of how this company was built." After we hung up, I sat quietly at the table. The notebook remained open in front of me. For the first time, I no longer felt like I was imagining things. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. And somewhere behind that pattern, I was beginning to sense a purpose that had not yet fully revealed itself. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking less about the embarrassment at the anniversary gala and more about the years that came before it. Once I started paying attention, memories surfaced with surprising clarity. They were not dramatic moments. In fact, each one had seemed insignificant when it happened. That was what made them so easy to overlook. I remembered a board meeting 2 years earlier when Vanessa suggested modernizing the company archives. Everyone agreed it sounded reasonable. At the time, I even complimented her initiative. Several months later, I noticed that some framed photographs had been removed from the executive hallway. When I asked about them, I was told they were being restored. They never returned. Then there was the annual employee appreciation banquet. For nearly 20 years, the company had presented a founder recognition award. Harold and I had always attended together. The year after he passed away, the award quietly disappeared from the program. Vanessa explained that younger employees preferred looking toward the future instead of celebrating the past. I accepted the explanation because grief had made me tired. Looking back, I wondered if exhaustion had prevented me from seeing what was happening. One memory, in particular, refused to leave me. About 18 months earlier, I had visited company headquarters to have lunch with Ethan. While waiting outside his office, I overheard part of a conversation taking place in a nearby conference room. Vanessa was speaking with 2 department managers. I did not catch every word, but I clearly heard her say, "People need to associate the company with current leadership." At the time, I assumed she was discussing marketing strategy. Now the statement sounded different. Current leadership. The phrase echoed in my mind. Had she been talking about customers, investors, or employees? The more I reflected, the clearer the pattern became. None of the changes happened suddenly. They occurred gradually, one small adjustment at a time. A photograph disappeared. A historical reference was shortened. An award was removed. A speech omitted certain names. Individually, each decision appeared harmless. Together, they created something much larger. They slowly erased the story of where the company came from. Late one afternoon, I drove to the small storage facility where Harold and I had kept old business records for decades. The unit sat on the edge of town beside a row of warehouses. Dust covered the shelves inside, and the air carried the familiar scent of cardboard and paper. For several hours, I sorted through boxes filled with photographs, newspaper articles, employee newsletters, and handwritten notes from the early years. There was far more history there than most people realized. As I flipped through the documents, I discovered dozens of records that directly contradicted the revised company narrative now appearing online. There were photographs of Harold and me signing our first lease agreement, letters from suppliers thanking us for years of partnership, newspaper stories describing how we built the company together. By the time I left the storage unit, the sun was setting behind the warehouses. My car trunk contained several boxes of materials I wanted to review more carefully. For the first time since the gala, I felt something stronger than confusion. I felt certainty. Someone had spent years reshaping the company story. The question was no longer whether it had happened. The question was why. And deep down, I suspected the answer would lead directly to Vanessa. 3 days after my visit to the storage facility, I received a phone call that changed everything. The number was unfamiliar, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. A calm male voice introduced himself as Daniel Brooks. The name immediately sounded familiar. Daniel had served as one of the company's outside legal advisors for years before retiring. He had worked closely with Harold during several important expansions, and I had always respected him. After exchanging a few polite greetings, his tone became more serious. He asked if we could meet in person. When I asked why, he paused for several seconds before saying that there were certain things I deserved to know. We agreed to meet the following afternoon at a quiet cafe near the courthouse. The next day, I arrived a few minutes early. The cafe was nearly empty except for a few office workers and retirees enjoying late lunches. Daniel was already seated in a corner booth. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes remained sharp and observant. After we ordered coffee, he reached into a leather briefcase and placed a thin folder on the table between us. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he studied me carefully. Finally, he asked a question that caught me off guard. "Margaret, when was the last time you reviewed the company's historical governance records?" I admitted that it had been several years. Since Harold passed away, I had stepped back from day-to-day involvement and trusted Ethan to handle operational matters. Daniel nodded slowly, as though he expected that answer. Then he opened the folder. Inside were copies of meeting summaries, archived communications, and organizational planning documents. Nothing appeared dramatic at first glance. Yet as he guided me through the pages, a troubling pattern emerged. Several internal initiatives had been launched over the previous 2 years with a common objective. Publicly, they focused on modernization and rebranding. Privately, they emphasized reshaping how leadership history was presented both inside and outside the company. I felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sunlight coming through the windows. Daniel pointed to several references that repeatedly appeared throughout the documents. Terms such as leadership transition, legacy repositioning, and narrative alignment surfaced again and again. The language sounded corporate and harmless. Yet the practical effect was clear. The contributions of earlier leaders were being minimized while newer figures were being elevated. My name appeared in multiple discussions. Not as a founder, not as a partner, not even as a former executive. I was increasingly described as a symbolic historical figure rather than an active part of the company's identity. Daniel watched my reaction carefully. "There is more," he said quietly. He explained that several longtime employees had privately expressed concerns. Some felt uncomfortable with the direction things were taking but feared speaking openly. Others believed that the company culture Harold and I worked so hard to build was gradually disappearing. As I listened, pieces that once seemed unrelated began connecting. The missing photographs, the revised website, the altered presentations, the anniversary gala. None of it had been random. It was part of a larger effort unfolding over several years. Before leaving, Daniel handed me a copy of the folder. "I thought you should see this for yourself," he said. As I drove home, the folder rested on the passenger seat beside me. For the first time, I was no longer searching for evidence that something was wrong. The evidence was already there. What I still did not know was how far the plan extended or what Vanessa ultimately hoped to gain. But I had a feeling that answer was waiting just beyond the next layer of truth. During the week that followed my meeting with Daniel, I read through every page in the folder several times. The documents confirmed that something deliberate had been happening inside the company, but one question continued bothering me. Why? If the goal was simply modernization, there would have been no reason to erase people from the story. There would have been no reason to quietly remove photographs, shorten historical records, or exclude founders from public presentations. The actions suggested something more personal. I spent several evenings reviewing old company materials at my dining room table. One night, while searching through archived newsletters, I came across a leadership development article published 3 years earlier. Vanessa had been interviewed shortly after joining the executive team. Most of her comments were routine, but one statement caught my attention. She spoke about the importance of creating a leadership identity that reflected the future rather than the past. At first glance, the remark seemed harmless. Yet after everything I had learned, the words carried a different meaning. The following afternoon, I received an unexpected email from Rebecca Collins, the former communications manager. Rebecca and I had always been friendly, but we were never especially close. Her message was brief. She asked if we could meet privately because there was something I needed to see. We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop near the public library. When I arrived, Rebecca already had a laptop open on the table. She looked nervous. After a few minutes of conversation, she turned the screen toward me. What she showed me was not a collection of historical records. It was something far more revealing. Rebecca had retained archived drafts from various communications projects she worked on before retirement. Among them were early versions of leadership presentations, branding proposals, and internal messaging documents. Several included comments and revision notes. As she navigated through the files, a pattern became impossible to ignore. Again and again, recommendations appeared suggesting that company communications should focus attention on a new generation of leadership. Certain references to founders were shortened. Historical sections were condensed. Recognition was gradually redirected. Then Rebecca opened a document that made me sit perfectly still. It was an internal presentation draft prepared for senior leadership. One comment attached to a slide contained a sentence that explained everything. The note stated that future growth would be easier if the company became associated with current leadership rather than legacy personalities. Beneath the note was a discussion thread. Several people had commented. One of them was Vanessa. Her response was clear. She wrote that investors needed to view the company as being built for the future and that excessive attention on previous generations created limitations. I stared at the screen for several seconds. It was not anger I felt. It was understanding. For the first time, I could see the real motivation. Vanessa was not simply trying to update company materials. She wanted to become the face of the company itself. The founders were obstacles to that vision because our history reminded people where the company truly began. Rebecca closed the laptop and quietly explained that many employees never saw these discussions. Most changes occurred gradually over several years. Few people noticed because each adjustment seemed small on its own. Yet together they created an entirely different story. As I drove home that evening, the situation finally made sense. The missing photographs, the altered website, the anniversary gala, the revised leadership timeline. Every piece belonged to the same strategy. And with the major leadership presentation only weeks away, I suspected Vanessa was preparing to complete what she had started years earlier. The invitation for the leadership presentation arrived 2 weeks later. Although I was still a shareholder and a company founder, the wording immediately caught my attention. Instead of being listed as an honored guest, I was categorized under general attendees. It was a small detail, but by then I had learned that small details often revealed larger intentions. The event was scheduled at a conference center overlooking the river downtown. More than 200 investors, executives, department heads, and community partners were expected to attend. According to the agenda, Vanessa would deliver the keynote presentation outlining the company's future direction. As the date approached, I continued gathering information while saying very little. That seemed to frustrate some people. A few expected me to complain publicly about the anniversary gala. Others appeared surprised that I was not demanding explanations. The truth was simple. The more quietly I listened, the more people revealed. Several days before the event, Ethan called and invited me to lunch. It was the first time he had reached out in weeks. We met at a restaurant near company headquarters. He looked tired. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and his usual confidence seemed diminished. For a moment, I saw the little boy he used to be. We talked about ordinary things at first. The weather, the grandchildren of old friends, community events. Then he carefully shifted the conversation toward the upcoming presentation. He spoke enthusiastically about growth opportunities and modernization efforts. I listened without interruption. Finally, he asked whether I planned to attend. I told him that of course I would. Something flickered across his face. Relief perhaps, or concern. Before we parted, he hesitated as though he wanted to say something more. In the end, he simply wished me a good afternoon and walked away. The exchange left me with more questions than answers. The night before the presentation, I reviewed every document one final time. Boxes of records surrounded my desk. Photographs, archived newsletters, historical reports, side-by-side comparisons, meeting summaries. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. Someone had spent years gradually repositioning the company's history. The upcoming presentation appeared designed to make that revised narrative permanent. Yet I also possessed something Vanessa did not expect. Evidence. Not assumptions. Not emotions. Facts. The following morning, I arrived at the conference center early. Large banners displayed the company logo throughout the lobby. Staff members moved between registration tables greeting guests. Conversations filled the air. As I entered the main auditorium, I noticed something interesting. Several longtime employees approached me quietly. Some shook my hand. Others thanked me for attending. Their words were polite, but their expressions carried something deeper. Concern, respect, perhaps even hope. I took my seat near the center of the room and observed the stage. A massive screen stretched across the front wall. Bright lights illuminated a sleek podium. Everything had been prepared carefully. Across the room, Vanessa moved confidently between guests, smiling and accepting compliments. She looked like someone standing at the finish line of a race she believed she had already won. Watching her from a distance, I realized something important. She still thought the story belonged entirely to her. She had no idea that another version of the story was sitting quietly a few rows away, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The presentation began exactly at 9 o'clock. Vanessa stepped onto the stage with the confidence of someone who believed every detail had been carefully arranged. The giant screen behind her displayed polished graphics, growth projections, and images celebrating the company's future. Investors listened attentively. Department heads took notes. Board members followed along with printed agendas. From the audience, everything appeared professional and impressive. For nearly 40 minutes, Vanessa guided the room through her vision for the company's next decade. She spoke about innovation, modernization, leadership development, and strategic growth. The audience responded positively. Yet as the presentation continued, I noticed the same pattern I had spent weeks investigating. Historical milestones appeared without proper context. Founding contributions were minimized. Entire chapters of the company's story were condensed into brief references. Then she arrived at the final section. A large slide appeared behind her titled The Leadership Journey. A timeline stretched across the screen. Harold appeared near the beginning. Ethan appeared prominently throughout the middle years. Vanessa occupied the final section as the leader preparing the company for its future. My name was nowhere on the timeline. Not reduced, not shortened, completely absent. The room remained quiet, but I noticed several longtime employees exchanging uncertain glances. Vanessa continued speaking as though nothing unusual had happened. When she finished, polite applause filled the auditorium. The moderator returned to the stage and opened the floor for questions. At first, the discussion remained routine. Investors asked about market expansion. Executives asked about operational goals. Vanessa answered confidently. Then Richard Lawson slowly rose from his seat. Richard had served on the advisory board for many years and was widely respected throughout the company. His voice remained calm when he addressed the room. Before we move forward, he said, I believe there is an important historical question that deserves clarification. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Vanessa smiled and invited him to continue. Richard glanced toward the leadership timeline displayed behind her. Can anyone explain why one of the company's founders no longer appears in the official leadership history? A quiet murmur moved through the audience. Vanessa responded professionally, explaining that the presentation focused on future leadership rather than a comprehensive historical review. The answer sounded reasonable at first. Then Richard requested that the board review several archived records before adopting the presentation as an official company narrative. The moderator agreed. At that point, Daniel Brooks stood and approached the front of the room carrying a folder. He did not make accusations. He simply requested permission to provide historical documentation relevant to the discussion. The board agreed. Daniel presented copies of archived company materials showing original leadership records, founding documents, and historical publications. As board members reviewed the documents, the atmosphere grew noticeably more serious. Then Rebecca Collins stood from the audience. She explained that during her years managing communications, she had preserved earlier presentation drafts and internal messaging records. With permission from the moderator, several of those materials were displayed on the screen. Side-by-side comparisons revealed how leadership narratives had gradually changed over time. The differences were subtle when viewed individually. Together, they told a very different story. More importantly, they revealed intent. Internal revision notes appeared. Archived comments were reviewed. Discussions about shifting focus away from legacy leadership and toward newer figures became visible to everyone in the room. No one needed to argue. The documents spoke for themselves. Around me, people studied the evidence carefully. Investors leaned forward. Executives compared records. Board members asked follow-up questions. For the first time that morning, Vanessa appeared uncertain. The confidence that had carried her through the presentation slowly faded as the discussion moved away from branding and toward documented facts. And as more evidence appeared on the screen, the room began to understand that what looked like modernization was actually something very different. The meeting did not end with shouting or dramatic confrontations. In many ways, that made the moment even more powerful. Facts have a way of changing a room without raising their voice. As the documentation continued appearing on the screen, people stopped, focusing on opinions, and started focusing on evidence. Original photographs showed Harold and me standing beside the first facility. Archived newsletters documented the contributions of dozens of employees whose efforts had been quietly removed from recent presentations. Historical reports confirmed timelines, decisions, and milestones exactly as they had occurred. One by one, the missing pieces returned to the story. The board members requested a brief recess to review the materials more carefully. During that break, conversations filled the auditorium. Investors gathered in small groups. Senior managers compared documents. Employees who had spent years with the company exchanged knowing looks. For the first time since the anniversary gala, I no longer felt isolated. I felt seen. When the meeting resumed, the atmosphere had completely changed. The discussion was no longer about future branding strategies. It was about preserving institutional integrity. Several board members expressed concern regarding the gradual alteration of historical records. Others emphasized the importance of recognizing every individual who helped build the organization. No one accused anyone of criminal behavior. No one made personal attacks. The focus remained where it belonged, on the facts. Vanessa sat quietly through most of the discussion. The confidence she displayed earlier that morning had faded. Ethan looked equally unsettled. More than once, I caught him staring at the historical photographs projected onto the screen. Some included images from his childhood. Images he had not seen in years. I wondered what he was thinking. Perhaps he was remembering the same things I remembered. The late nights. The sacrifices. The years when success was never guaranteed. Eventually, the board chairman stood and delivered a brief statement. An independent review of company historical materials would be conducted. Archived records would be restored and properly preserved. Future presentations would accurately reflect the contributions of all founders and key leaders. The announcement was met with immediate approval throughout the room. Then something unexpected happened. Several long time. Employees stood and applauded. Others joined them. Within seconds, much of the auditorium was on its feet. The applause was not directed at me alone. It was directed toward the truth that had finally resurfaced. Toward the people whose efforts had been forgotten. Toward a history that deserved to remain intact. I remained seated for a moment before slowly standing. My eyes drifted toward a photograph on the screen showing Harold and me during the company's earliest years. We looked young, exhausted, and determined. I smiled. Not because I had won something. Not because anyone else had lost. I smiled because the story now belonged to the people who actually lived it. As guests began leaving the conference center, Ethan approached me quietly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked at the photograph still displayed on the screen and said he was sorry. It was not a perfect conversation. It did not erase the past, but it was honest. And sometimes honesty is where healing begins. Later that evening, I returned home and placed the final folder back onto my bookshelf. The house felt peaceful again. Outside, the last light of sunset settled across the backyard. I stood beside the window for a long time thinking about everything that had happened. In the end, the humiliation that once seemed unbearable became the very thing that exposed the truth. People can ignore a voice. They can overlook a person. They can even try to rewrite a story. But facts are patient. They wait. And sooner or later, they find their way back into the light.